At the moment of interruption, the adjournment debate for this evening has been chosen earlier. Therefore, to be resolved that this government releases the Cape Breton Public Housing Asbestos Report. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in a very serious matter in my riding, Mr. Speaker, and all across the province of Nova Scotia. Asbestos in public housing, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the minister yesterday tabled a report by Pilinch and LeBlanc, and I've had a copy of that report in the earlier on, Mr. Speaker. And in that report, I'll note that there's some facts that I've been trying to get the internal report done by Mr. Cyril LeBlanc and David Ryan, which was an internal report that was done and given to the Department of Environment and Labour. Department of Environment and Labour have since finished their investigation, but one of the members that have done the investigation took seriously ill and had some heart problems and had to go to Toronto. So I don't know when I'll receive the report on the asbestos from the Department of Environment and Labour, but hopefully it'll be in the near future, Mr. Speaker. The problem I have with that, Mr. Speaker, is that asbestos is a very serious carcinogenic material once ingested into the lungs. Causes numerous lung cancer, mesothelioma, many different illnesses caused by this disease. But the problem I have is that, Mr. Speaker, is that I'm not going to say anything about the integrity of the man that did the internal investigation, Mr. Cyril LeBlanc. But I know myself, if I was to do something wrong as an MLA and I would have Mr. Dexter tell me to investigate myself for my wrongdoing. Ultimately, Mr. LeBlanc was in charge of housing at the time. He's no longer in charge. Now he's the regional coordinator for community services for Eastern Nova Scotia. But the thing that goes on, Mr. Speaker, is that we have people that are still living in an environment that they go to bed every night, and above their beds are caution, may cause cancer or lung problems. I don't think it's proper for anybody in today's society to have that hanging over them while they're living there with children, Mr. Speaker. And in that report, I'll note something in that report, is that the men that are working there for the Island Housing Authority are still working there. Now, nobody's ever been held accountable for them having this report. 6 months. 6 months they've had this report in their hands, a letter stating to them that the possibility of vermiculite insulation in these units containing actinolite, asbestos. Now, nobody's ever been held accountable. These families and these people were living in these units when they were put new chimneys in, new roofs, and this stuff poured all over them. I'll give you one example of Tracy McNeil, a young lady, single mother, 4 children, living in that unit. Her daughter's bedroom is downstairs. The daughter is downstairs, and they're cutting holes through the unit, and the stuff is pouring out all over the place. It's getting late, so the mother tells the men to go home from work, and she'll sweep it up. It's everywhere. Mr. Speaker, they knew about the possibility of this vermiculite containing asbestos in October of 2005, and it wasn't made public until I made it public on April the 7th of 2006. Nobody has ever been held accountable. One thing about asbestos, Mr. Speaker, it takes many years, many years to sit in your lungs before it causes medical problems, 10 to 15 years. And in this report that the minister tabled yesterday, these procedures meet and for the most part exceed various provincial and federal standards for this type of work, talking about how wonderful job that they did sealing those units up. Again, I bring back to the sticker, sealing the units up. Mr. Speaker, nobody's been held accountable. Nobody in that department has been held accountable. It's been a year, October of this year, over a year, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the problem with that report is that they did the test on these units, and I'll tell you that 90% of the tests were done on unoccupied units. Why didn't they do the test when the asbestos was pouring all over the people living in there? Why didn't they do the test when they had families that were living in there? They did the tests on these units unoccupied. Nobody in there. So how could they get a good reading if there was asbestos? Some of the tests came back with 1.6%, and that's above the standards for asbestos. But yet nobody's been held accountable in that department, Mr. Speaker. And I'll tell you that the minister said yesterday when she passed in the report by Pinch and LeBlanc, there is obviously this appropriated amount of unoccupied units compared to occupied units. Had this been a concern to PLEL at the time of requesting a list of units, then we would have made our concerns known. Even the company that did this report that minister tabled yesterday has concerns about doing tests on unoccupied units. Have a gentleman living in a seniors unit, lost 40 pounds. Have contractors that worked on those facilities for years and years and have brought this to this department. Mr. Gillis, Mike Gillis, suffering tremendously with lung problems. Nobody's been held accountable. He's done contract work for over the housing for almost 20 years. And over 14 years or so, have kept reporting to the housing. And he gave a binder to the former minister and asked the minister to look into this. And Mr. Speaker, I cannot wait for the day that the Department of the Environment and Labor put that report on that table over there, so we all, as members of the Legislative Assembly, can see what was done to those people, Mr. Speaker, living, and the department knowing that they were living. They replaced 93 chimneys. They had to cut 93 holes and watch this stuff pour all over the place. 93 cut holes in the roof, pour it all over the place. And now they're going to say, well, you know, like I had said, well, maybe it's a class action lawsuit, maybe something can be done here. But I mean, the way asbestos works, it doesn't affect your health until many years down the road. As a former coke ovens employee that worked in asbestos and know, you know, this asbestos has to be removed from public housing in the province of Nova Scotia. But again, I'll say, and I'll repeat myself, nobody's been held accountable in that department for exposing the workers, the people living in those units, to asbestos. And here we are today in the year 2006 and have nobody accountable. Nobody. Exposure. I mean, I can think of all the families. People have moved out of there in such many numbers because they're afraid. They're afraid. They're afraid. And yet yesterday the minister said that the legal department had said that they cannot table that report. The legal department. Well, I thought the people of Cape Breton Nova elected me to protect the health and safety of those people living in Cape Breton Nova, especially the people living in public housing and the people living in that whole riding. My job as a legislator is to protect the health and safety of the people that I represent in this House. And how can I do that when I cannot get a report to know what was in that units and what they were exposed to? How can I best represent the people in this legislature if I can't have a copy of that report so I can report to the people that were affected by such a hazardous material, and I can't look at it? I have to go back to my riding and tell the people that I represent that this government will not give me that report. How do I feel when I drive back home and I got to tell them that I cannot get that report? I don't know who's going to be held accountable. You know, and those men that are still working there, working for the same coordinator that had that report, they're still working for him. They have to report to him. They have to report to the safety coordinator. There's interviews that were done, and I spoke to these people. And I spoke to these people personally. And the interviews were done, some were interviewed for 2 to 3 hours by the Department of Environment and Labor. And yet we don't have a copy of that. But we don't have the internal report. My concern is for the health and safety of the residents that I represent in this legislature. When I'm denied access to a report that would help me better understand what happened to them and what put those people at risk, that's what my job is to do when I'm an elected official, is to tell those people. And they keep asking me, you know, when is anybody going to be held accountable? Nobody's been held accountable in that department for such a hazardous material being poured all over them. Children. Again, I go back to Tracy McNeil. I brought this case to the minister's attention. Doctors wants her out of there. She's got a single mother with 4 kids. The doctor wants her out of there. You know, wants her out of there. But yet, the housing department says if she puts a transfer in, her new rent will be based on 25% of her salary. This is a woman that's not on community services. This is a woman that works very hard, volunteers at the school breakfast program, coaches the elementary school basketball team, and works full-time and works lots of overtime. And yet her kids were exposed. She wants out of there, and she can't because she'll have to pay 25% of her salary. She wouldn't even be able to clothe her kids for the winter. Now we're going to put somebody back on the system because of this here. I find it very difficult as a member of the Legislative Assembly to be denied access to a report that's done, completed, and I cannot tell my residents that I represent that I am not allowed to have that report. It's very disappointing as a member of this Legislative Assembly.
Thank you. The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, rise and say a few remarks about this particular issue. And I want to thank my friend and colleague there from Cape Breton Nova for bringing this once again to the attention of the legislature. He's been working very hard on this issue because he knows and I know that there are many, many problems connected with the with the units Cape Breton Regional Housing Authority has in our area. And when I say there are a number of problems, you know, the asbestos problem is only one of the problems that they're having down there. They're having a great deal of problem with the units themselves, with substandard conditions in some of them, and a slowness to put these units back into adequate working order and livable conditions, I guess, are the words. And you know what, Mr. Speaker, the problem we have with the vast number of people who need good, clean, affordable housing, the units aren't there. And the units aren't there because I don't think there's a will on behalf of this government to ensure that there are a number of adequate units that are free of asbestos, by the way, and units that would be used by the many, many people. And I know that my colleague in Cape Breton Nova answers the same number of calls as I do, or probably even more, about people looking to get into adequate housing and at the same time protecting their safety while they're in that housing. And there doesn't seem to be any interest, and I, first of all, don't blame the people who work in the housing business in Cape Breton. The Cape Breton Housing Authority are trying to do their best, I think, with limited amounts of money at their disposal, because I don't think the government considers the provision of affordable housing for people who are on low income, single mothers with children who are desperately trying to find places to live. And now they have the additional problem that if they take a unit in some of the units that the member from Cape Breton Nova describes, then they have to be concerned about their safety and the safety of their children in these units. So it's not only a situation where they're having difficulty getting the unit in the first place. And you know what, Mr. Speaker, the Housing Authority has a system now where they put everybody on a list. And if you're down on the list, you have to wait your turn, no matter what your circumstances are. And I think there's something fundamentally wrong with that. Nothing's an emergency with them anymore. You know, that's right. And nothing is an emergency anymore. It almost seems that the mission statement from this government and its Community Services Department, who I've had much to say about in the past when I was a community services critic and housing critic, and continue to be frustrated at the way that department has gone from a caring institution in the past with social workers running that department to a bean counter operation that prides itself on saving money on the backs of low-income people in this province. And I think that's tragic, Mr. Speaker, because, you know, right now this department gave a huge bonus to its deputy minister last year for running a tight ship. You know, rather, she should have received a bonus if she could come to this legislature through her minister and tell the people of Nova Scotia that the people are getting adequate housing in Nova Scotia and they're getting adequate amounts of money to live on, and that they, single mothers and their children, Mr. Speaker, are being adequately looked after and not forced into slum housing units. And Mr. Speaker, I can tell you, the slum housing units in my area are proliferating. They're growing and growing because, guess what? Those businessmen, those entrepreneurs know that the units of housing in our area are becoming less and less. The empty units we have are not being fixed up people in an expeditious manner so people can get in them. Rather, they're saying, if you don't like our housing, go down the street and get a slum housing unit. And here's the problem there. Community Services has a limit on the amount of money they'll pay for rent. And guess what again, Mr. Speaker? The slum landlords know what that limit is. And they charge $20 or $30 over the limit, so the person not only has to pay the maximum amount of money for a substandard unit, because they're afraid, some of them, to go into the units that my colleague talked about. But in addition to that, they have to dig into their food allowance or the supplementary allowance to pay additional rent in these substandard units. So it's not fair. And Mr. Speaker, the problem is that they don't have an advocate. These people do not have an advocate except the MLAs in the area, or people that are genuinely concerned about their plight. They can't access any government programs on their own. My colleague knows that, and every other person who deals with people who are counting community services know that they just cannot access government programs. The community services office down in Sydney now is like a fortress. You know, you can't get in there. You can't see any workers. You know, I've got no problem with the regional administrator of that department down there, except that he does not have a degree in social work. And I've always maintained that people who run the Department of Community Services should be social workers, not accountants, not lawyers like they have here in head office in the Department of Community Services, but social workers. You know, Dr. Fred McKinnon, if he was alive today, would probably drop dead if he knew what was going on, you know, in the Department of Community Services today. That people cannot access the programs, they cannot get adequate housing and adequate allowances in order to live. Now, on top of all of that, the topic that we're dealing with tonight has them afraid, the ones that are living in there, to say anything about it, afraid to leave because they might not get another unit, and the government is not forthcoming with the answers as to whether or not they're at risk. You know, and I think after saying all of the problems that are connected with the people accessing public programs in community services and housing, they still have to worry about, if they do get a unit, whether or not they and their children are going to be safe. And the biggest problem that we face in my constituency and in the member from Cape Breton Nova's constituency and a lot of the other constituencies around ours that we're familiar with is dealing with people who need adequate housing, dealing with single mothers on limited incomes who are trying to improve their lot in life, and they're getting no assistance from the Department of Community Services. They're not given any indication that things are going to get better for them, and the waiting lists are growing. I understand today there are 600 on the waiting lists between seniors and people that need affordable housing for their families. And that list is growing, Mr. Speaker. That list is growing, and the units they do have are falling in disrepair. They're having problems. They're not fixing them up, and as my colleague said, you know, like, the answers are not coming from this government. You know why, Mr. Speaker? This government does not consider the problem. If you listen to the minister in question period, time and time again, answering questions on community services, there are no problems. In her mind, there are no problems. That minister will stand in her place and say that they are looking after the people of this province. Well, I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, they are not looking after the people of this province. People are hurting out there. You know, they're becoming a forgotten group. The unemployment situation in Cape Breton is improving. It's improving. It's improving right across Nova Scotia, but it's not improving for this group of people. It's not improving for those on fixed incomes that have to depend on community services. Just because the employment numbers drop a couple of points, nobody should be beating their collective chests over there about the fact that everything is all right in community services. It isn't. Those people are hurting, and we see it, and we hear it, and we live it every day. Most of the calls that I get in my constituency, Mr. Speaker, are connected to mothers with dependent children looking for housing, looking for the adequate monies throughout the month to try to get to the next payday, next check from community services. And, you know, they are literally afraid to death of two things. One, they're not going to be able to provide adequate support for their children, and if they are lucky enough to get a house or a unit of public housing through the authority, they have to concern themselves on whether or not it's going to be safe. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to my honourable colleagues across the floor. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today on this very important topic, in this resolution. Every day, the Department of Community Services and the housing team provide a whole range of housing supports and services. These are programs that help meet the diverse needs of lower-income households. And we help Nova Scotia families maintain and acquire or rent safe and adequate affordable housing. Through the housing authorities, we administer more than 20,000 units of social, including public housing, cooperative housing, nonprofit housing, seniors' homes, and rent supplement units. This includes more than 12,000 rental housing units for families, for seniors, and the rent's based on household income, making homes that are safe and affordable available for low-income Nova Scotians, and that's something we've done for some time. This government is very proud of its outstanding work of the staff in the 7 regional housing authorities and housing services offices and throughout Nova Scotia, not just in Cape Breton, all over the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, the honourable members of this House will remember that the discovery of insulation containing asbestos in public housing by the Cape Breton Regional Housing Authority came as a surprise to the Department of Community Services and to this government. You will also recall, Mr. Speaker, that this government acted immediately when this issue first came to light. The Department of Community Services set out to find out exactly what happened. This is why the internal report was requested by the department. We take the health and the safety of our public housing residents very seriously, Mr. Speaker, and I can assure you and the honourable member Cross that this report was requested with the health and safety of our tenants in mind. We share the preliminary results of the internal report on May 12, 2006. The preliminary findings identified the following. There seemed to be a lack of understanding of the potential seriousness of the test results, and it appeared that there was a breakdown in communication. People up the line who should have known about this lab report were not informed. This is why we consulted with national and internal environmental experts who have the knowledge and the expertise to provide us with direction. And this is why we consulted with the Regional Medical Officer of Health, Mr. Speaker. This is why we shared information from Health Canada and met with the residents so they could be assured the Department of Community Services was working with these experts to ensure their homes are safe and secure. The government hired an international environmental consultants, Pinch & LeBlanc Environmental Limited. Pinch & LeBlanc released the first part of their report in July of 2006. That report confirmed that the Cape Breton Island Housing Authority handling the vermiculite insulation exceeded provincial federal standards. The international experts, the authorities on the handling asbestos, have confirmed in their report that the Housing Authority exceeded provincial and federal standards in the handling, procedures, and materials used for containing the vermiculite containing the insulation. Yesterday, the Minister of Community Service rose in this House to table a letter from Ann Roberts, the Regional Medical Officer of Health. Mr. Speaker, I would like to read that letter, and it reads, as the Regional Medical Officer for Health, for environmental health issues, I want to reiterate that the risk of exposure to vermiculite containing asbestos is extremely low as long as the asbestos is not disturbed. As long as it's not disturbed, Mr. Speaker. For asbestos to present a problem to people, it must be disturbed so that the tiny fibers are released into the air. My review of the Cape Breton Island Housing Authority's air monitoring test result of the terraces in Ashby and Whitney Pier, Mr. Speaker, areas of Sydney indicate that no fibers were detected in the air. Today, the Minister of Community Services has been asked to release...
Order, please. The honourable member for Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if the honourable member would entertain a question at this time.
Would the honourable member entertain a question?
Certainly.
Well, I'd like to thank the member. I'd like to ask the member and his statement that he just said, I'd like to ask him, when they were repairing the roofs and the chimneys and the insulation was pouring out of the holes they were cutting in the roofs, does the member or does the Community Services Department feel that these residents were exposed?
The honourable member from Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. I will take that question back to the Minister, and she will take the time, I'm sure, to determine that, Mr. Speaker, through to you, to the honourable member, and get back to you on that. Continuing on, Mr. Speaker. Today, the Minister of Community Services has been asked to release an internal review by the Department about vermiculite insulation that contains asbestos in Cape Breton. The Minister of Community Services has said in the House before that to release this report at this time would be premature. The investigation, the Department of Environment and Labour continues. The Department of Community Services has been advised that this report should not be released while an official investigation continues by another government department that has the power to lay charges. Furthermore, the Department of Community Services has been advised by justice lawyers that we must also consider the legal rights of certain individuals that would be identified in this report. We have to ensure that legal rights are not compromised before the conclusion of the formal investigation, Mr. Speaker. At this point, just to summarize, environmental experts have said that the Housing Authority took the appropriate steps to address asbestos in public housing. Environmental experts have said that the Cape Breton Island Housing Authority's air monitoring test results indicated that no fibers were detected in the air. Health experts have said that so long as the asbestos is not disturbed, it doesn't pose a health risk. Mr. Speaker, I know that across this province there are many housing units. My mother actually had moved into one recently, and she quite enjoys living in this facility. One of the honourable members that spoke this evening spoke about the rundown, the condition. I guess both maybe have spoke about the conditions of these. And what I found, at least in the area that I come from, in the Hants area, in the Valley area of Nova Scotia, the facilities are in quite good shape. And if there are problems, they fill out the appropriate paperwork for maintenance, and they are managed relatively quickly, actually. The people that live in these facilities certainly enjoy living in them. There's no question about that. There's great camaraderie, card games, bingos, etc., Mr. Speaker, bus trips, entertainment. You never hear them complaining too much about the facilities in general. The only thing they mention is it's not the same as living in their homes that they had been in for many years. But they are quite happy to be there. They enjoy the people that are there. They enjoy having the ability to live in a place, to have the heat and the lights and everything all in one, to be looked after, whether they're on community services or otherwise, or paying their own way. You don't hear people complaining about the facilities where I come from. And I know that this isn't just about Cape Breton, and we continue to focus on the issue in Cape Breton. This is not just about the people in Cape Breton. This is about the people in Nova Scotia. And it's important to remember Mr. Speaker, speaking with people, again, I just want to reiterate that the people, not just in the Valley either, throughout, it doesn't matter where I've been, and I've worked in healthcare for 17 years, and I've been in many of these facilities, whether they're the Kendall Heights units or the Centennial Apartments, or whether they're units in other parts of this province, whether they be in Halifax or they be in Yarmouth or wherever they may be, Mr. Speaker. A lot of these places are in very good shape, even though they are aged, have been looked after and maintained well, Mr. Speaker. And I just want to say in closing that no matter which department, no matter which the Department of Community Services and this government takes more seriously, is the safety and the well-being of the people in Nova Scotia. And if there are issues, they will be taken under advisement. They will be looked at seriously, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I want to thank all the honourable members for having taken part in tonight's late debate. The motion for adjournment has been made. The House stands adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow.